The initial effects of the Depression were similar to what was seen elsewhere. As the demand for goods declined, there was less inflow of capital. This in turn meant deflation and a rise in unemployment. There was a fall in foreign investment, and most countries found themselves in financial trouble as they were significantly indebted to foreign banks, like, for example, banks in New York City. As those banks themselves faced collapse, they also demanded an immediate return of their investments, but in most cases, this was impossible. So we have a vicious cycle here. Protectionist measures, like Smoot-Hawley, of course, the most famous version, in other countries, also made Latin American goods unaffordable. The decline in revenue meant that Latin American countries could not repay their debts to keep governments afloat. There were exceptions. Venezuela's oil and Honduras's bananas kept them solvent, but these were anomalies. Most countries were facing economic collapse. The immediate effect of the Depression in many countries was political change. Placing blame on existing governments, there were a number of coups d'etat. In the year after Wall Street crashed, the military took power in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Honduras, and Peru. So essentially, these became dictatorships, and while their treatment of the population and respect for the rights of individuals were dubious at best, they did at least have at their disposal the mechanisms to change economic policies and to address the crisis. They could do what they wanted. They were dictators. From the Depression onwards, state intervention in the economy would become the norm. This was true to some degree in the U.S., greater degree in Canada, but I would say even larger degree in Latin America. Latin American leaders generally had three approaches to addressing the crisis. The first was government regulation to stabilize the local economy. Governments would set prices, establish maximum levels of production. Sometimes this included the destruction of surplus goods, and this was done to bolster the existing economies and help them regain their strength. Recall that the U.S. Tried something like this, but volunteerism doesn't work very well. But when you have a dictatorship, you can set prices and you can set production levels and ensure they're held to. The second kind of category of strategies was called import substitution industrialization, or ISI. The goal here was to encourage the creation of homegrown industries to replace Latin American dependence on foreign manufactured goods. That worked to varying success. It worked over time brilliantly in Brazil. I've seen aircraft being manufactured in Brazil, and they're a leader in that today, and that has its roots in this policy in the Depression. Lastly, governments tried to keep their international markets open by engaging in bilateral trade agreements with industrialized countries. After the disaster of Smoot-Hawley, the U.S. Passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. They signed something like that with King in Canada. This also they went about doing this in Latin America as well. In many cases, these policies led to a rapid recovery. Mining and agriculture were not hit as hard as the industrial sectors, so these products could be used to bring about recovery. Additionally, the economic model that had been adopted prior to the Depression included a close relationship between banks and the government. Financial reforms of the 1920s included the creation of central banks and regulatory institutions with clearly defined rules. This made government intervention in the financial sector easier than in other countries. You recall the U.S. had created its central bank in 1913, but it didn't have much power to intervene in banks, and Bennett created the Canadian Central Bank as a private institution in 1934. King nationalized it in 1938. Mexico created theirs in the 1920s, but some Latin American countries were ahead on this, and that control of a central bank made it easier to fix the financial problems. Many countries left the gold standard and pegged their currencies to the U.S. dollar, and that aided their recovery. Britain eventually would leave the gold standard, and they didn't suffer as long as we did. We refused to leave, and we paid the price. Despite difficult financial times, Latin American countries did not default on their loans. They used non-payment as a temporary measure to bring about recovery and kept the faith in their currencies. Now, ultimately, these policies brought Latin America out of the Depression, but the social inequalities caused by class and racial hierarchies that had plagued the region since independence remained and were in fact heightened by the economic distress, much like they were in the U.S. The leaders that came to power as a result of the Depression did not simply have to bring about economic recovery, they also had to address social and labor issues that had languished for over a century. Many of these leaders adopted a populist stance. Arguably, you could call them demagogues, to co-opt the working and middle classes. And the degree of success these men had varied, and the results of their rule were contentious.